All right, welcome back everybody to episode 8 of the second season of the Building Lifelong Athletes podcast. I'm your host, Rennicke. Thanks so much for stopping by. I really appreciate it. And today we're going to talk all about how to interpret a lipid panel. So when you go to the doctor's office, you get a lipid panel or a cholesterol panel, you get some specific things. We're going to talk about it today. We're going to talk about what it means, what you should be looking for, and how to feel more comfortable with that test. So let's get going. Okay, so first things first, our standard lipid panel, there's like 4 main things that pretty much every single lipid panel is going to have. That's total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, and triglycerides. And then some tests include things like a cholesterol to HDL ratio, like total cholesterol HDL ratio, or maybe something called a non-HDL, but like in reality, total cholesterol, LDL-C, HDL-C, and triglycerides. That's like going to be every single cholesterol test ever. So, and one thing to note here is this LDL-C. And we talk about HDL-C, LDL-C, what that means is cholesterol, right? So what it's measuring is actually the amount of cholesterol on these lipoproteins. So not the lipoproteins themselves. So we're not actually counting the lipoprotein particles. We're counting the amount of cholesterol on them. It seems like it's not a big point, but it actually is kind of important. So just understand we're not counting the actual particles. And for LDL, it's actually calculated and not physically counted. So that's another thing we'll talk about in the future, but just worth mentioning that is going to be calculated and not actually counted. And so if we're looking for, some tests will include a direct LDL sometimes as well. Like I said, usually those are not standard, but direct LDL would be the sum of IDL, LDL. So like I said, is getting more actually counting of the LDL. And then also sometimes there are things that you'll see VLDLs on there as well. Obviously those are the VLDL cholesterol, usually the concentration of the cholesterol. But of note, it is worth mentioning that when they do calculate VLDL or LDL, those are calculated using triglyceride levels. And so that's why we do recommend it's best to get these done when fasting, right? So when you're fasting, there's pretty much no chylomicrons or cholesterol remnant particles in there. And so not going to have as many VLDLs or IDLs floating around. It kind of gives us a better input on things. And it can also throw off of our values. If your triglycerides are through the roof, it might not be as accurate. And so, and additionally, when we talked about non-HDL, like I said, that is becoming more and more common. That is being shown on lipid panels that I've seen at least. And the goal for that, when we look at that, it's going to be about 30 milligrams per deciliter higher than the LDL goal. So like obviously when we look at our LDL goal, usually is around like 100 or less. And then so with a non-HDL, it'd be up a little bit by 30. So essentially we want to be less than 130. So taking a step back, total cholesterol, HDL, LDL, triglycerides, those are the main things we're going to look at here. And then we'll kind of dive in a little bit further. Okay, so starting with that total cholesterol, right? So when we think about total cholesterol, we talk about everything, right? So we're talking about HDL, LDL, VLDL, IDL, chylomicrons, LP(a), remnant cholesterol, all these things. So literally anything that is carrying cholesterol, that's what we're counting for, right? And so on top of that, it is worth mentioning that it is not actually including triglycerides, right? So cholesterol is just the actual cholesterol that is being carried on lipoproteins, not necessarily triglycerides, which triglycerides essentially are the triacylglycerol concentration within all of the triglyceride trafficking lipoproteins. So essentially the cholesterol is counting all the cholesterol, whereas the triglyceride is like the triglyceride content inside of all those things too. So a little bit like confusing, but if you think about total cholesterol is just looking at the cholesterol and total triglycerides is looking at the triglycerides inside of those lipoproteins. And of note here, the total cholesterol is, like I said, the content of every lipoprotein in milligrams per deciliter of plasma. So essentially, once again, all the cholesterol on carrying all the lipoproteins. When we look at our LDL-C, so the LDL is once again the cholesterol content of IDL and LDL, so not just LDL, but they include IDLs as well because there's so few of them. HDL, once again, the concentration, the amount of cholesterol on HDL particles. VLDL, same thing, what's being carried on the VLDLs. Remnants, what's being carried on the remnants. And then LP(a), this is the cholesterol content of the LDL particles that have the ApoA attached to it. So we've talked about LP(a) and how it's pretty genetic and it can be an increased marker of cardiovascular disease, but it is also technically a component of the total cholesterol. And it's kind of semantics here though, because usually it's included with the LDL numbers and stuff. But like I said, once again, I just want to show you that the cholesterol number is including all of the different things there. And so that was a whole lot, right? Really, man, like holy cow, remnants, LP(a), like IDLs, Jordan, what are you talking about? Well, let's make it a little more practical here, right? So now let's look at fasting considerations. So when someone's fasting and get a lipid panel, it kind of makes it a little more simplified. So this is what I recommend. There are, the guidelines say you don't need to be fasted because, if that's a barrier from someone getting their cholesterol checked, then we want to eliminate that barrier. And like I said, for sure, having a non-fasting lipid panel is better than not getting one at all. And so, like I said, you do what you can and that's okay. But when we are fasting, the calculus changes a little bit, right? The total cholesterol concentration and the calculation changes a little bit. So it's more like HDL plus LDL plus VLDL. And that's pretty much it, right? Once again, we know that if triglycerides are elevated, we can have some abnormalities, but what's happening is when we're fasting, essentially there aren't any remnants left or IDLs. And so that kind of takes them out of the equation. And also on top of this, the reason more simplified here and they don't have LP-A is because most people don't have a huge amount of LP-A. And so it kind of is excluded from the formula, not really that impactful for us. Also, it's worth mentioning that if your triglycerides are elevated to anywhere like 150, 200 or higher, then, first things first, that could throw off our numbers a little bit. And also it's kind of indicating that there's a delay in the catabolism of ApoB lipoproteins. So, right, the ApoB lipoproteins that have triglycerides, there's usually a delay in the catabolism if our triglycerides are that high. And then with that, we might have an elevated total cholesterol content. And like I said, it might not accurately reflect particle number. So if triglycerides are greater than 100, then typically what we want to use is something called non-HDL would be a better marker than LDL. It just seems to be more accurate. However, if it's under 100, then non-HDL is essentially the LDL and they're kind of interchangeable. All right, next concept I want to talk about is LDL-P versus LDL-C. LDL-P is the LDL particle, whereas LDL-C is the LDL concentration. Might seem not that big of a difference, but it actually is. Like I said, LDL-C is a calculation, so it's kind of an estimate of the amount of cholesterol in the LDL particles. It doesn't count the particle number. So the reason we care so much about these is because these two numbers can be discordant. Discordant meaning one might be up, one might be down. You would expect that if you had really, really high LDL cholesterol, your particle number would be high, but that's not always the case. It typically is the case, but not always. And so if they're discordant, that's not accurately predicting risk, right? So let's say if LDL-C, or the total concentration, is low, well, there's tons of small particles. We know that's bad. Specifically in insulin resistant states, so when people are insulin resistant, they commonly have really small LDL particles, but there's lots of them. And sometimes LDL-C may not even be elevated. So in that situation, let's say our LDL-C looks normal, right? But we have tons and tons of small LDL particles. Well, we know those are super atherogenic. That is not a low risk state. And so we're kind of being misled by our information that we're seeing there. And so on top of that, LDL-P, this is not standard on tests, right? This has to get special testing. And so it's not as, important necessarily that you need to get an LDL-P, but I just want you to know that, understand that concept. They're not necessarily the same. And we'll kind of talk about the next marker that we kind of do that will be a proxy for that. And so I just hinted at, LDL particle. Well, there is a proxy for that, and that's essentially our ApoB. ApoB is our ApoB 100, like apolipoprotein B100, and that's seen on things like VLDL, IDL, LDL, and Lp(a), essentially not HDL, and then also not chylomicrons though, because chylomicrons, if you remember way back, they have ApoB 48, so it's different. But we look at ApoB 100s on those VLDL, IDL, LDL, Lp(a). And why do we care about it? Well, it's probably our best tool for correlating risk because it accounts for all the potentially atherogenic lipoproteins, like I said. But once again, it is about 85% LDL, so the majority is LDL. And so that's why before, the LDL particle test is part of like a fancy panel. It usually is pretty expensive and not that easily obtained, whereas an ApoB is a separate test. It's not part of the standard panel, but you can order it pretty affordable and gives us a pretty good picture of all the atherogenic particles that are kind of floating around. And at the end of the day, chylomicrons, VLDLs, IDLs, and remnants, they have half-lives of like 4 to 6 hours. So like they're kind of clear pretty quick, whereas LDL is like 2 to 3 days. So that's why like it pretty much is just the LDL accounting for ApoB. And like I said, it's not a one-to-one at all by any means, saying like the ApoB is not looking at LDL particles specifically, but the majority of that number is LDL particles. And we like the ApoB because it's telling us how many potentially atherogenic particles are floating around the bloodstream. Okay, and so I'm talking about potentially atherogenic particles, right? So, what determines which lipoproteins get into the endothelium? That's a great question. The big three things are the particle concentration, the size, and endothelial integrity. So, first things first, from a size perspective, anything less than 70 nanometers can get into the endothelium. And LDL usually runs about 18 to 23 nanometers. So, regardless if it's a big and fluffy one or a small, dense one, they can get in. So, that's the big thing. And unless it's a huge VLDL, it's going to pretty much get in. And so, the small particles like VLDL, LDL, and small IDL, and even remnants can get into the intima. On top of that, we always talk about concentration, right? Like if you have a ton of particles, right? Just by general diffusion, you think there's going to be a higher pressure on there to get into the endothelium. And so that counts as well. And then obviously endothelial integrity, meaning if you have damage to the endothelium, the damage to that barrier cells of the artery, then it's easier for something to get in through. So this is really important. I just want you to understand that because I know sometimes you'll see things online or hear something online that like, hey, I have the big fluffy LDL. And so that can't cause atherosclerosis. And that's like patently not true. It's definitely small enough to get into. Now the whole question behind, is it more atherogenic? Is it not? It looks like it's probably not. But like the fact that they say like I can't get it, it's like that's just not true because the size of it is small enough to get into. Now whether it gets taken in by the endothelium, the subendothelial space, and all that stuff, that's another question. But there is enough, it is small enough to get in regardless of what type of LDL you have. And so I'll kind of just talk about big, fluffy versus small ones. I kind of want to show you what it looks like for someone who is like insulin resistant. There's kind of like a patient profile when you see someone who has insulin resistance. It's kind of classic for them. Typically, they'll have a low HDL, elevated triglycerides, maybe some elevated ratios where the total cholesterol or the triglycerides to HDL are elevated. And then sometimes they may have a normal LDL, but probably elevated non-HDL as well, which, kind of non-HDL includes other triglyceride containing compounds. But at the end of the day, usually what happens is that we see this HDL is low, right? So HDL being low seems to be tightly correlated with ApoB issues. And we especially see this with insulin resistant patients. And so the question is like, well, okay, like what do I do for a low treatment of HDL? Well, nothing really. You don't treat HDL. It should really start, your treatment should be like treating the ApoB particles, right? So when we see a low HDL, what I typically think is that person insulin resistant? Is there something going on metabolically that's not there? But we've seen lots and lots of trials where people have tried to target HDL, and they've tried and tried, they've looked at it and they've tried to treat it and increase it. And then when they increase it and they have success doing that, it doesn't lead to any clinical outcomes. So a low HDL is not saying, hey, we need to hit this specific number. There are goals that we're generally looking for in terms of, greater than 40 for men, greater than 50 for females. But that being said, that's not like the number one goal. If like your HDL is normal, but your ApoB is through the roof, like we still want to take care and manage that ApoB particles. And the same thing likewise, if your HDL is super low, we're not going to say we need to get HDL up. We want to make sure we're managing you kind of holistically and making sure that ApoB and the LDL is kind of managed as well. All right, so now I'm gonna walk you through how to look at a lipid profile. So you'll see 7 things listed here, and these are just kind of a list of 7 things. This is not necessarily how you have to look at them. These are just the general idea of what we're looking for. I would say the first and second step are kind of, are 1 and 2 for, that's pretty accurate where they are in location. But after that, there's a bunch of different things listed there just kind of for completeness. But I'll kind of walk you through what we're looking for with these numbers, and I'll kind of break it down in the next slide for like how I kind of look at it. So first things first, so looking at triglycerides, we do care about that. So if your triglycerides are over 500, it's pretty much a do not pass go. We need to get that lowered. Like I said, it's not because like you're at an imminent risk for cardiovascular disease or a heart attack or anything like that, but actually it really increases your risk for pancreatitis. And if anyone's ever seen someone who's had pancreatitis or had it yourself, it is not a good time. It does not look fun at all. And so if triglycerides are over 500, that's a high risk for getting pancreatitis. And so our first step is like, oh shoot, we need to get that lowered. And so that's like our main step is like get it under 500. So if you look at triglycerides though, and it's less than 500, then we can kind of go on to the next steps there. And then I'd say the next step we're gonna look at is, looking at our LDL-C or our non-HDL or ApoB if we have it ideally, and kind of looking there. Like I said, for LDL-C, based on the ACC/AHA guideline, this is what most people use as LDL just because it's, like I said, the most affordable and part of the standard panel. And if it's over 190, that's another one we say, ooh, probably want to start a medication or at least really, really, really work on getting that lower. But looking at LDL, once again, we're going to look at those numbers and say, hey, talk with the patient, understand the risk and stuff. But if it's not over 190, then we can kind of talk about other markers to kind of help clarify our risk as well. And so, like I said, in that situation, looking at LDL, we can also look at non-HDL. And once again, the non-HDL is our total cholesterol minus HDL. And it can be really useful if our triglycerides are elevated, right? So if in step 1, triglycerides are elevated above 150, 200, anywhere in there, then calculate that non-HDL might be more useful. And obviously if we have the ApoB number, that can be helpful as well. But first step, triglyceride. Second step, some sort of marker, LDL, non-HDL, or ApoB is really helpful. And then third, we're usually looking at the HDL. So HDL, we want to make sure that, if it's less than 40 for males or less than 50 for female, that kind of like gets us concerned. Once again, like I talked about, it's not like I'm driving treatment off of this. Like we need to get your HDL up. Instead, for me, it's more of like a marker, right, of general metabolic health. I kind of think like, oh, is there insulin resistance going on? Is there something happening when our HDL is low? And so that's more of a just a area of concern. Just kind of look at it and say, hey, remember that profile we talked about, the insulin resistant person, high triglycerides, low HDL. Just kind of once again painting that picture. And then once we have that, that's honestly enough for the vast, vast, vast majority of people in terms of, look at all the guidelines. That's what they talk about. They talk about LDL numbers, maybe ApoB. We could talk about LP(a) in a little bit, but like we look at triglycerides, look at our LDL, non-HDL or ApoB, and then we look at our HDL. That kind of gives us like the general risk. And then we have all the other things we can do. So like, looking at ratio. So obviously, triglyceride, total cholesterol to HDL ratio, anything greater than 4 is an issue. Also look at a triglyceride HDL ratio, which if it's greater than 3.8 in women, 4 in males, that can be potentially concerning. But once again, like I don't know. And there's also like an ApoB to ApoA. That we are not going to get a standard lipid panel, so I don't really care about that one too much, but I'm just including that for completeness that some people will talk about it. But once again, like we want to keep it more simple and more practical, right? Like I don't want you to spend thousands of dollars on cardiovascular lipid testing because I don't think it's necessary. If you look at like the vast majority of the data and out there, the recommendations, like you just need a simple lab test. And if you want to increase it a little bit with ApoB and LP(a), that I think that's reasonable as well. But like if you got a standard lipid panel, it's definitely not worthless. Like some people will be like, it's worthless. It's definitely not, because that's what all the data is on. Is it perfect? No, it's not. No lab test is ever perfect, but we can get the vast majority of that done here. So I'm going to kind of talk about like my process behind this. All right, so let's put it all together right now. So we kind of talked about stuff here. Here are the nuts and bolts of it. All this is going to depend on your personal risk level, right? So when we have a conversation, a physician and patient, they're going to have a conversation. They're going to come up with a plan together. This is never just advice from some person saying, hey, this is what you need to do. This is always a joint decision, right? So, and then on top of that, we should work through it systematically. So when we look at these, we want to make sure we're kind of having a checklist, because when you go through things systematically, you don't miss things. And, I think that's really important. So like I said, first things first, we're looking at triglycerides. If it's over 500, we should probably act on that, get you down so you don't have pancreatitis. And then once that's out of the clear, right, then we look at LDL or non-HDL or ApoB. And once again, if triglycerides are elevated, probably looking more at that non-HDL or ApoB number, whereas if triglycerides are really low, LDL will probably be pretty accurate. But once again, if I think I had to pick one here, I'd pick ApoB just because it's a actual, we're actually counting the particles there. But hey, if we don't have that or can't afford that, then we can use a non-HDL or LDL, and that's okay too. And after we look at those numbers, then we look at the HDL, right? We're just looking generally for the HDL, kind of, is it low? Not for treatment, just understanding. And then after that, we have ratios. We have all the fun little stuff that we can do there. There's ratios we can look at. And like I said, people put more weight into those than other things, and that's okay. They might be helpful, but for all intents and purposes, if you have the first three things I talked about, that's generally going to take you pretty far. And then on top of that, I did want to mention that, goal-wise, we're looking at our LDL or non-HDL. An LDL goal, if you've already had a heart attack or a stroke or something like that, we want to be under 70. So otherwise they recommend, around 100, less than 100 is ideal. The recommendations will honestly say like less than 130, but I think for most people it's probably less than 100. But just want to point out that like if you've had an issue before, we want the LDL super low. If you have not, we still want it relatively low, less than 130 or 100. So putting it all together, like I said, when I get a lipid panel, it's just a tool to help me understand your risk, right? It's not everything. I'm going to look at this lipid panel, but I'll also order labs looking at your blood sugar and your electrolytes, and I'll look at your general standard screening things and kind of put everything together to paint a picture of, what does your risk really look like? Because obviously one thing doesn't tell, everything. If you have, maybe an LDL of like 600, you're like, okay, like that's probably something we need to work on. We need to talk about it. But obviously everything's going to be nuanced, and we're going to have, this multiple pieces of information that are going to be put together. And so there are guidelines like I talked about that, have blanketed statements, but everyone is individualized, right? And if you think about it, what works for you might not work for someone else. And you kind of have to think about each individual person and kind of work together. And at the end of the day, it's really about having the conversation between the physician and the patient, right? So it doesn't make any sense if the doctor just says, hey, do this. Like, well, okay, if there's no buy-in, it's not gonna matter. And at the end of the day, also, if someone's kind of driving and saying, hey, the patient's saying, hey, I want to do this, and there's no medical reason to do that, that's not great as well. So we're really working together as a team. And like I said, I always treat patients just like that. They're patients and they're not numbers, right? It's very easy. I think today in our social media world and our data-driven world, we can say, hey, these numbers need to get down to now. But at the end of the day, like people are still people, right? And they have concerns and they have questions and they have things that they can do and things they can't do and things they won't do. And so you kind of have to work together to kind of figure out what's a plan that's going to be, sustainable and work for them, right? One thing that works for someone might not work for someone else. And so at the end of the day, you have to step back and say, hey, what can we get you to do that will be helpful for you? I think is the best case scenario, reduces your risk, but also something that's actually practical and you can do. Like I said, so I hope you found this helpful. This is my approach to kind of understanding when I look at a lipid panel, what am I looking for? Where do we go from there? Like I said, I hope that this empowers you and that it was really helpful. Like I said, if you did like this or found it helpful, it would mean the world if you liked, commented, subscribed, or shared it with a friend. Honestly, sharing this with someone would be like the best way to get this out. And I'd really, really appreciate that. So thanks so much for giving me your attention and spending time with me. It means the world to me. Now get off the computer, go live your life. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks.